Okay, everyone, welcome to this week's lecture on the golden ratio Fibonacci sequence still life painting lecture. We'll go over the lecture first and talk a little bit about what is required throughout this project, but also sort of see from previous students' work what is possible in order to create our still life paintings um, under the module tab. So, with its origins in the Middle Ages and ancient Greco-Roman art, still life painting emerged as a distinct genre and professional specialization in Western painting by the late 16th century and has remained significant since then. A still life form gives the artist more freedom in the arrangement of elements within a composition than do other paintings of other types of subjects, such as a landscape or portraiture. Now, throughout this process, we'll look at some artistical references, talk a little bit about the history of still lifes, where did they come from, and how we sort of categorize the term still lifes in order to sort of get a better understanding of how we can create our own from home. And part of this process is to always sort of keep in mind how we can start to also dissect, but also sort of analyze the process of visual analysis, but also sort of how to recognize the differences between old master to contemporary artists when working in the still life format. Now, let's go over our learning objectives. So students will understand the golden ratio, which is the ratio of 1 to 1.618, also known as the Fibonacci sequence. Students will identify the differences between layering colors starting from dark to light. This is a key thing to remember. An emphasis on structure and within the relationship and arrangement of objects by using various painting techniques will be explored. And finally, students will understand the variety of contrast and value when using colors to successfully depict the illusion of three-dimensional forms in space. Now, obviously, throughout this process, we'll look at some examples from students' work from previous quarters, which you can kind of sort of see here in this example here from the left, which a student did a wonderful job in the sort of assignment that they were sort of using. Now, for the materials that we need for this assignment, which will be the Blick Studio Stretch Cotton Canvas traditional profile, 16 by 20 inches in its scale. You may use larger stretch canvases, but it's completely up to you. But a minimum size is 16 by 20. We also have the Blick canvas pads, which have the scale of 12 by 16 inches. Should be about 10 sheets in there, and that's a really great, helpful sort of test or also sort of preliminary painting before you start your large scale painting. Think about them as a sort of a sketchbook for painting. You have our Utrecht Acrylic Paints. You should have all 10, if you purchase your supply kits, all 10 colors in there. And then we have a sort of value pack brushes that is available for you for the long handle as well as sort of the sort of Bristol sort of brushes, a set of 7. We also have our slow drying medium that we're going to be using that helps slow down the drying time. A cup of water, mainly obviously for cleaning. And then finally, we have our aluminum sort of ruler that we're going to be using for the actual grid itself. Now, let's talk a little bit about the history of where do sort of the question of still life paintings emerge, but also where did it come from? Still life paintings were simply decorative in its intent, but with realistic perspectives, were found in the Roman wall paintings and floor mosaics unearthed at Pompeii, found in the homes of rich Romans, demonstrated the range of food enjoyed by the upper classes as a sign of hospitality and as celebration for the seasons and of life. And it's interesting when we sort of think about the ideas of how we thought about pleasure, but also how the Romans enjoyed their pleasures of life, everyday life. This specific example we're looking at here is the glass bowl of fruit and vase, which is sort of a part of the series of frescoes from the Roman wall paintings in Pompeii, which date around 70 AD, which is located in Naples in the National Archaeological Museum of Italy. And another thing sort of keep in mind is sort of thinking about how can we sort of see but also learn from these artistical references in the context of an actual still life painting. Now, let's talk a little bit about the question about the how in which we sort of see. Let me stop this. Stop. Now, for the assignment itself, this is what we're going to be using. Now, mathematically speaking, the golden ratio is the ratio of 1 to 1.618, also known as the golden number in art and design, creating an aesthetically pleasing image through balance and harmony. Now, some of us actually may be sort of familiar with some of this image of this sort of spiral sort of like sort of shape that starts from this sort of center here and curves its way around towards the bottom right half of this rectangle. The golden ratio relates to the number of 1.618. In mathematical terms, is known as an irrational number, meaning it has an endless series of digits that do not repeat and cannot be expressed as a simple fraction. The mathematical concept of the golden ratio originated around 500 BCE, but some credit Greek scholars like Euclid and Pythagoras with it, but it was actually this gentleman here, Leonardo Pisani Fibonacci, from around 1170 to 1240, who was an Italian number theorist. He introduced the world to such wide-ranging mathematical concept as what is now known as the Arabic numbering system, the concept of square roots, and even math word problems. Now, it's interesting when we sort of think about this because the Fibonacci series, or the sort of sequence, is a series of numbers in which each number is the sum of the two that preceded, starting at 0 and 1. The sequence looks like this. Now I'll try to move my mouse here to kind of make it a little bit more clear. So 0 and 1, you'll get 1. 1 and 1, you'll get 2. 1 and 2, you'll get 3. 2 and 3, you'll get 5. 3 and 5, you'll get 8. 5 and 8, you'll get 13. 8 and 13, you'll get 21, and then so on and so forth. On and on forever. Now, I want us to sort of think about this sort of concept of this, but also how do we sort of apply this in the context of our actual still life painting? Let's talk a little bit about the rule of thirds. Now, the rule of thirds is the general guidelines of how to create an interesting composition, which states that any image, painting, photograph, graphic design should be broken into a grid with 2 vertical and 2 horizontal lines, creating 9 equally proportioned boxes. Now, this is really interesting when you sort of think about this in terms of the golden ratio. Let's look at this specific painting here by the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tope by the artist Rembrandt during 1632. And this is an oil painting that he was working on during the Baroque Dutch golden age of Baroque paintings. Now, if we're looking at this example, you can see here that Dr. Nicholas Tope is performing an autopsy with his medical students here on the left. And the central key figure here is sort of kind of aligned where this sort of lighter, sort of light cerulean blue of this figure would be at this intersection. Now, the bottom half of this sort of, the bottom right, you see another intersection here of this square. And you see here in the bottom left, there's another intersection of this square, and we have another one here. The question is sort of figuring out how do we use the ratio of 1.618 to the actual painting itself, right? Now, some would also sort of think about this in terms of a mathematical problem, but the best way to remember this is to sort of figure out and take your calculator. And what you want to do is multiply the size of your painting to the actual picture plane, right? So if our painting is 16 by 20 inches, right? So we take 16, multiply 0.618, we'll get about 9.88. And usually that's going to be the smaller side. So we'll use this as an example. If I start off with the top left corner here and measure down at this here at the bottom left, this would be 16 inches right down here. 9.88 should roughly be right around here, right? Now, if I flip my ruler, so I inverted my ruler. So now this up here in the top left is 16, and the bottom here is about 0. The same rules will apply. So 9.88 should actually meet right about here. Let's do the other side. So we're doing the vertical, right? Straight up and down. Let's try the horizontal, which is the sort of wider side, which will be 20 inches based off of our actual painting itself, right? In terms of our measurements. Now, 20 inches multiplied 0.618 equals out to be about 12.36, right? Now, again, we could try this again. So let's start off with our ruler here at the bottom left and measure out to the right. If we started from the bottom left here as 0 and measured out all the way here to 20, 12.36 should be right about here, roughly. And we're going to do the same thing again, and we're going to invert our ruler. So again, we're going to start off with 0 here on the bottom right, and then on the bottom left here will be a 20, and 12.36 should roughly be around here. And you notice if you do this on all 4 sides, what do you get? you actually get these four intersections, these four squares. And this is where artists want to sort of figure out, but also sort of think about the placement of your objects. Where are key components or the most important focuses on the objects themselves or the subjects in your actual painting? So I want everybody to sort of apply this in the context of this assignment, but also sort of see, does this work for you, right? Is this an option for you to use as your painting itself? Let's talk a little bit about more. So, now let's look at some more artificial references, talk a little bit about light sources, which is another key element of your setup of your still life. This is the artist Willem Kampf's still life with a silver ewer and porcelain bowl, excuse me. This was dating back to 1655 to 60, and this is an interesting oil painting that showcases a wonderful source of light. Notice the sort of luminosity of light, how it transfers from the silver ewer here to the glass sort of this larger goblet here on the sort of top background here, as well as sort of the reflection of the blue and white porcelain bowl here on the bottom right. But you can kind of sort of see these sort of citrus fruits here that were peeled directly on the surface really give us this really great sense of transparency and reflective light. Because you could also sort of see the light of the objects here on these fruits are also being reflected onto the other objects themselves from the silver ewer as well as sort of the goblet. And this is really pivotal to sort of think about the ideas of where is your actual light source coming from, right? From this, we can also sort of see other artists like Kof Spernij's sort of salad bowl, which is another painting. It's an oil painting on linen, who's from the Netherlands, who also uses a lot of hyperrealism within some of his work, but also sort of is focusing on those everyday mundane objects, right? These are sort of things we can kind of sort of think about, but also sort of understand even further, what could we learn from those sort of examples? You can kind of sort of see here in this sort of painting with the jars and quilts is a great example of showcasing sort of the transparency of the materials of these large mason jars, but also sort of the beautiful texture of the artist Lauren's sort of work of how they incorporated watercolor on paper in order to create this sort of sense of density. Gail Roberts is another artist from San Diego, California, who worked with, again, everyday mundane objects. This is a sort of pile of trash that she worked on a series of works. I believe the sort of collection of these series of paintings were sort of inspired by this sort of those objects from her environment, but also sort of seeing how the beauty can be sort of incorporated from a pile of trash. Here's another great example from the artist Kopsberg. This is the sort of the standard sort of objects we see in a diner, ketchup bottle. We have sort of, again, salt, pepper shakers. But this is another great example of showcasing the objects we neglect, but also can be used throughout this assignment. Zio Z is another artist who uses a lot of texts, but also a lot of books from libraries and other institutions to use for his hyper-realistic paintings. And these are sort of questions you want to sort of think about of how I want to be mindful in sort of including specific objects that are a part of my own personal collection, right? And I want everybody to sort of use this in the context of how we can sort of exercise, but also sort of keep in mind of nostalgia, but also sort of keep in mind of the cultural objects we collect. But another sort of key thing to remember is sort of thinking about how to make it grayscale. So a grayscale, also known as achromatic grayscale, which is a collection or the range of monochromatic gray shades ranging from pure white on the lightest end and pure black on the opposite end, right? And I've done this example here, and you can more than happy to you can do this as well on your canvas pads to kind of practice to kind of get a good range of value. It's to sort of measure out from the pure lightest end here of just white, just titanium white, and I measured about sort of 3 inches high, right? And this sort of gives you a range of sort of, again, highlights, midtones, shadows, and just pure black on the darkest end towards here on the right. These are sort of things I wanted to sort of explore because it's always the question, how much should I add, right? And also sort of thinking about the question about where is the light source coming from, or the areas in which the light is originating from. How do we develop contrast, which we can be created through any differences, including value, color, texture, and size. And then finally, the shadows, which is the areas on the objects where light does not hit. All of these are sort of explorations we'll do at home in our studios, but also sort of experimenting with paint itself. How do we apply more or less than what we actually need? And how we sort of think about that is crucial. Now, another key thing to sort of keep in mind is the concept of the color wheel. Now, this is a part of our assignment which will be required, so keep this in mind. Now, on the 12 by 16 canvas pads, begin by measuring out about a 10-inch diameter or 25-inch, oh, excuse me, centimeter circle to create your color wheel. Now, I actually like to use a large dinner plate and sort of use the back of the dinner plate to kind of measure out the width of that. I say about 10 inches diameter because that's actually going to help you tremendously. Remember to start off with your primary colors, then move towards your secondary, tertiary colors. Now, you can measure this out specifically if you want to get precise. You can kind of sort of see here this triangle measured out to about 5 inches each. You don't necessarily have to. I'm not really interested in the measurements, to be honest. I'm more interested in sort of figuring out the primary, secondary, tertiary colors. Now, a hue is a color on the color wheel, also known as a color itself. So anytime if we're talking about a hue, we're talking about a color, right? Now, let's talk a little bit about a breakdown of this. How do we read this color wheel? Now, let's start off in the center. Now, these are sort of the three primary colors. We have a red, you have your yellow, you have your blue. Now, these are colors that cannot be mixed or created in order to create these colors. This is something to sort of keep in mind. Now, a secondary color are two primaries. Now, if we mix some red and some yellow, you will get ideally an orange, right? If we mix some yellow and blue, ideally we should be getting some green. And then finally, if we mix some red and some blue, we should get a purple or a violet, right? Pretty self-explanatory, starting from that center, right? Now, when we work our way out, this is where it gets a bit more complicated, right? Now, the question is, how do we make a tertiary color, right? Which is sort of, again, one primary and one secondary, which will make a tertiary color, right? Now, you can kind of sort of see here, if we mix a little bit of the red with some orange, you get a red or orange. Again, if we mix some yellow and some green, we get a yellow-green. And then finally, we could also sort of do the same thing if we mix some green and some blue, we get a blue or green, and so on and so forth. All of these are great examples of showcasing how to use the correct colors, but also sort of how much should we add in order to mix those colors. Now let's talk a little bit about the temperatures of the color wheel itself. You can kind of sort of see here, we have warmer colors here on the left, and then we have cooler colors here on the right. We can start off by looking at this sort of more redder violet. We have our violet here, our blue violets, our blue greens, and our greens themselves. And starting off with our warmer colors, we have our yellow greens, our yellows, our yellow orange, orange, red orange, and red. Temperature examines warmer or cooler colors that appear on the color wheel, right? So if we're trying to think about the intensity of one color or the other, right? How do we analyze this in the context of using warmer or cooler colors? But also, let's talk a little bit about saturation, also known as intensity or chroma, which indicates how vibrant a color is. A desaturated color is grayed or dull, while a saturated color is vibrant and strong. You can kind of sort of see in this example of this red, it's a fully saturated at 100% of its purity of its color. When you're desaturating color, you're graying it out. You are making it more gray or dull. This is one thing to sort of think about the intensity of lowering saturation or sort of, again, increasing saturation. Where do you sort of find the line in that? Now, let's talk a little bit also about the tints, the tones, and the shades. Now, I talked about saturation before, now which is sort of adding the tone, which will be a color of gray. But if we're adding a tint, you'll be adding your titanium white to sort of lighten it up, or sort of, again, almost softening the sort of the intensity of that saturation when we're looking at that value from pure red here on the left all the way up to sort of a lighter, sort of almost pinkish red. And on the bottom here, we have the shade when we're adding a little bit of black to the actual colors. All of this indicates how a darker or lighter a color is, which will be considered the value of color. So one thing to keep in mind. Now, when we're setting up our still life, another thing to sort of keep in mind is setting up the correct orientation best for your paintings. This is one thing a lot of my students always have difficulties remembering because it's easily, possible to fall into the trap of indicating if your portrait orientation refers on your reference is in portrait, then your actual painting itself is set in landscape, then obviously it may look warped or maybe too widened, right? Now, portrait orientation refers to when the frame is in the vertical display, which means that the side of the edges are longer than the bottom and top edges. Landscape orientation generally refers to the canvas's orientation in the horizontal display. This causes the image top and bottom edges to be longer than its sides, right? Now, one thing to also sort of keep in mind is that if I have an orientation here in portrait, if my reference is in portrait orientation, my painting has to be in portrait orientation. Same thing with landscape. If my painting is in landscape orientation, therefore my reference has to be in landscape orientation. They must be the same. So please double check before you start off this project. Now, there's another option I always talk to my students about, regardless if they're not using the golden ratio Fibonacci sequence for their still life painting, is to how to utilize a grid. Now, this is something that I actually recommend all my beginning students to do, is to apply the grid on your reference. I like to do this digitally myself. I like to take the original photograph here, make it a slightly desaturated, lowering down the contrast, almost looking much more duller, and actually draw these actually series of diagonals, vertical and horizontal lines on top of this image digitally. Now I use, I believe it's called Preview on my Macintosh, on my laptop, but I believe you should be able to sort of find any sort of software to do this. But you could also print out your image if you want to do this as well. Now, to first off, you want to be able to sort of first draw a series of diagonals. Now you can see here, we can start off from the bottom left corner and we're connecting it to the top right. And then we're doing the same thing from the top left corner and connecting to the bottom right. You'll see here we made a series of diagonals and you just found your center, right? Then we add a vertical line from the top to the bottom and another horizontal line here on the sort of center, indicating the perfect center. Now, those of you who do not like measuring, this is one thing I would also sort of keep in mind, right? You're going to do the same thing, the same repetition for all four squares, and therefore sort of indicating a series of vertical and two horizontal lines. Then you're finding the center of all four squares. Those of you who have difficulties setting up the composition and also sort of figuring out your scale, your proportion, how large the objects are, this is one of the recommendations I would highly encourage you to do, right? Now, if you need help with this, feel free to upload your photographic reference online under the assignment tab. Send me a message on Canvas or send me just an email letting me know, Ayad, would you mind helping me laying out a grid on my reference? I'll be more than happy to do that for you. Takes about 5 minutes, nothing longer, and I will send that back to you directly. Okay. Now, there's so many different avenues for starting off this still life painting assignment. A few key ones I would want to go over today is blocking and underpainting. Now, blocking is the step after your sketch in which the canvas is covered with flat shapes that indicate where elements will go and what colors or values there will be. You can easily shift and change things around in the blocking phase because no investment has been made into details or precise colors, and then paint. And then the paint will be thin. And another one would be sort of underpainting. Now, underpainting is an initial layer of paint applied to the ground, meaning the surface of the painting, which serves as the base of the layers of paint, often in monochromatic sort of colors, and helps to define colors of value for later paintings. Now, depending on how you want about sort of go about doing this, you can kind of sort of see here, blocking or sort of indicates here on this image on the right, really kind of has this more geometric flatness of color, but also you can kind of see what colors will be sort of used, almost sort of a paint by number sort of system. But underpainting is much more sort of thorough, but also sort of looser in terms of a gestural mark, applying one monochromatic color, as you can kind of sort of see here as this burnt sienna, of really applying it as one sort of beginning layer. Then you would actually apply the next darker colors, but also warmer colors or cooler colors, depending on the subject, on your actual setup. I want everybody to sort of explore with each one to sort of see how blocking works, but also underpainting, and see what resonates with you personally. Now let's talk a little bit about some of these examples of students' work from previous quarters. This will also help generate some ideas of what objects you would like to incorporate within your actual paintings themselves. You can kind of sort of see here, like these two were focused on fashion, but also sort of jewelry and other sort of, again, more feminine objects they wanted to incorporate with. It is completely up to you how you want to go about doing this. But again, I always like to say be creative, have fun with this process, right? Be intentional of what sort of instruments, what sort of cultural objects, what sort of fabric, what sort of fruits, vegetables, foods, other sort of objects you collect around your house, plants, even stuffed animals, right? You can kind of sort of see here that there's no sort of wrong way of doing this. I always like to find it much more interesting where students have much more personality. We're also sort of thinking about those things that they have every day around their environments. There is no wrong way to do this. But also, I want everybody to sort of keep in mind, you can kind of sort of see here, some of these paintings are not finished, which also indicates that, again, paintings will never be completely finished throughout this process. What I want us to sort of keep in mind is sort of seeing the layering process, but also sort of technique, the ways in which the color looks more translucent, much more opaque. How can we go about doing this, right? What sort of brushes do we use? What sort of, again, how much water should we apply? How much medium should we apply, right? All of these things factor in within the paintings themselves. And I always like to suggest is that there is no such thing as a bad painting, but there is a sort of bad process you can start off with. So this is one thing to keep in mind, right? All of these examples will indicate to kind of give you an example, but also sort of an identity of who the artists were, right? It should be a direct reflection of you as yourself, right? Rather than showing a portrait of yourself. You can kind of see here, the student here was really fascinated with baking during the pandemic. I don't know, excuse me, this is before pandemic. But this also gave you kind of an example of kind of what's possible. They really like to kind of bake. These are more sort of recent examples here where students were applying. I believe this was on campus, if I'm not mistaken. Some of the arrangements that we had on campus, but that I set up for everyone to use, right? But this also tells you so much about, again, different types of textures, what kind of fabrics you use, what kind of materials you use, what kind of objects. Are they reflective? Are they sort of just, opaque? Now, let's talk a little bit about what students will be submitting, which are the following three images. You first have your color wheel. Now, your color wheel should always be on your canvas pad. So keep this in mind. 12 by 16 canvas pads, 10 inches in diameter, okay? The next will be a well-documented photographic reference, right, of your actual still lifes. I need to see something what you've submitted. And your completed still life painting, well lit from natural light with no filters, no alterations, documented and submitted online under the assignment tab. Now, obviously, this refers to in person. We're going to ignore this because obviously we're doing this online. But remember, these are the things you should be submitting by that due date. If students have additional questions or concerns, please let me know. Send me an email or message on Canvas and notify me beforehand, and I will do my best to respond back, but also sort of to give you some feedback beforehand. Alrighty, and that's going to be the end of the lecture today.